Okay, welcome to Psychology of Close Relationships again. This week, our topic will be social cognition in close relationships. In social psychology course, we addressed specific topics about social cognition as it is related to inter-individual processes. Today, we will review some of these inter-individual processes and some key phenomena in social cognition literature, but we will also draw links between the social cognition basics and how they appear, how they are manifest in close relationship contexts. So let's get started. Okay, so let's first start with the definition of social cognition. What is social cognition? Cognition means mental processes, thinking, inference making, decision making. So these are some basic higher order mental processes that human beings are equipped with to make sense of the world around them. So social cognition refers to the processes involved in forming inferences and making judgments using social information. Social information is any sort of information that we receive from the social context, from the environment that we are together with other people. So, social cognition means that human beings or social perceivers are trying to make sense of what's happening around them, especially in their interactions with other people. They try to understand and they try to make sense of the meaning of these events taking place so that they can survive, adapt, and attain their goals in different contexts. So there are some general principles involved in social cognition. These are some theoretical principles which would organize our thinking about the results of our ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving in interaction with other people and are making sense of them. So, first of all, social cognition assumes that there is too much social information around us. We might think that we know little about other people, but actually, when we are in interaction with other people, there are many why questions that the mind is trying to answer. And we receive or much amount of information from the outside world. And remember, information processing capacities of human beings or the social perceivers are limited. We have a short-term memory. We can process a limited amount of information in a given period of time. So we have to minimize the load of the outside information for our minds so that we can effectively work on this information to make sense of what's happening outside us. And social reality must be represented in such a way that the amount of information is reduced to overcome overload. So we try to minimize the amount of information. Okay. So for instance, a person can be very talkative, very sociable, very understanding and caring. So a person can be defined by many, many different personality traits. But to minimize the workload for our minds, we simply categorize these kinds of people as extroverts. One word, one label, one category would be sufficient to understand or to make sense of any behavior of such kind of a person rather than each and every time we remember specific traits for this person. So the amount of information must be reduced to overcome overload for our limited information processing capacities. Secondly, social reality must be represented in such a way that it becomes, or it must be represented quickly so that we can survive and adapt to the social contexts. So our minds are very quick at making first order categorizations. So we should keep this in mind. It's very important. And if we are basically driven by survival needs, then since the system uh, operates in a very fast mode, in fast mode, we can make errors in decision making. We call these kinds of errors not errors actually, we call them biases. Therefore, social cognition processes are open to different kinds of thinking biases. Okay, so much social information, a need to reduce the amount of information to overcome overload, And we should do this quickly so that we can survive and adapt. And since we are that quick, we are biased. So these are very important basic principles which will guide us understanding how people make sense of their relationships and why they make so. Okay. In the relationship context, some relevant topics of social cognition would be forming impressions and perceiving the reality in our interactions. So as for forming impressions, some questions would involve how we form and maintain these impressions about other people. So suppose you are meeting with a stranger, it is your first date, okay? But you can have a quick idea about this person. How do you do so? How does the mind operate to have a first impression about this stranger so that perhaps it will influence your decision about dating again? Or forming impressions might involve a question about how these first impressions or these impressions influence our subsequent social information processing. Once we form an impression about another person, it means that our mind had already categorized this person. So this person becomes predictable, controllable. And then remember, we would like to keep or maintain the predictability of the social reality. So do we change our behaviors when we learn something new about these people, or are we engaged in perceiving other behaviors in the future from these people by assimilating these behaviors to our existing first impressions, first categorizations? And therefore, we expect, and there are biases in our social judgments, always in our interaction with other people, including ourselves actually, but also in romantic relationships. The second topic which would be relevant for social cognition in the context of relationship is perceiving the reality. Reality about what? Reality about the relationship, understanding the relationship, making sense of the relationship, having inferences about how the relationship is going, okay? So perceiving the reality about relationships includes some processes that we call idealization of the partner, attributional processes, how we explain our behaviors and our partner's behaviors in the relationship context, memories about our partners, and relationship-related beliefs and expectations can guide our inferences about our relationships. And finally, our self-perceptions can influence our preferences for selecting, choosing among partners, or our preferences or motivation for maintaining our relationships. So this is a general outline of the basic topics that we will address today. So let's get started with first impressions. A first impression is a fast impression, first of all. What is a fast impression? A fast impression is an initial categorization of the individual that we are interacting with in our minds, okay? We categorize people. On the screen now, you observe the experimental material that is used by Barnita and Lintz in their experimental study about forming first impressions, the very first impressions. You can find and read this paper. It's a very interesting empirical and actually experimental study about how we form our impressions. So how is this experiment conducted? How was this experiment conducted? So on the screen now, you see three different groups of stimuli. Now I'll explain you the basics of this kind of experimentation. In impression-related experiments, we expose participants to faces only, as you observe here, okay? There are faces, okay? These faces are chosen from a pool of stimuli which are known to be roughly equal in terms of their attractiveness, okay? And as you observe, basically, these faces are quite neutral faces, okay? And they are limited in their size so that the dimensions of the face do not influence attractiveness, as you observe. So how is this experiment, how was this experiment patterned? The participants were exposed to different faces, a very, very different faces, many number of faces, let's say 90 faces, okay? But There are different experimental conditions in which the participants were exposed to these phases. For some phases, the duration of exposure was 26 milliseconds. For some phases, it was 39 milliseconds. And for some phases, it was a little bit, quite a bit longer, 1.700 milliseconds. Okay, so what is a millisecond first? A millisecond is 1,000th of a second. So there are 1,000 milliseconds in a second. So 26 milliseconds is just like a flash, a very quick appearance on the screen, okay? It's not very easy to collect information, but it is possible that the mind can capture this photo beyond your consciousness. 39 milliseconds is also a very fast presentation, whereas 1,700 milliseconds is about 1.7 seconds, less than 2 seconds, let's say. So in this experiment, participants first are exposed to this phase, okay, for a certain duration. And then in the middle, you see an oval picture, which is a random noise picture, okay? This is called a mask, so that the mental image is somehow curtained in the mind, okay? I wouldn't like to say it's forgotten, but it's curtained, okay? So that it doesn't come to the consciousness. And then on the screen appears a plus in the middle of the screen, a plus appears, and the participants were asked to fixate, look exactly on this plus sign, okay? So that their attention is fixed on a neutral stimulation on the screen. And meanwhile, in this 1.2 milliseconds, while they are looking at the screen on the plus sign, they were asked to make judgments about the face, okay? So they are asked to make very fast judgments, the first impressions they have, very quickly in 1.2 seconds. So they were asked, how threatening is this person is, tehdit edici. There is no other information than the face of this person, remember. Okay, so the mind has to make sense of it. And here, making sense requires that the participant decides whether the person is a threat or is not a threat, and they make quick judgments by pressing buttons on the computer keys, okay, on the keyboard. So, and they say it's very threatening or it's not very threatening, and so on. So the critical point is that some people saw these faces for only 26 milliseconds, very fast presentation, some for 39, some for 1.7 seconds, okay? So what do we expect? We are trying to, in this experiment, the researchers are trying to understand the minimum amount of time required to make the first impression. That's why we have this kind of a design. So what happens? After being presented with many faces, for each face they made judgments, threat judgments. And look at these graphs now. I'll try to make them sensible for you. Now, on the left panel of this graph, you observe the correlation between 39 millisecond ratings, 1 least threatening, 5 most threatening. So the correlation between an individual's 39 millisecond ratings and his or her ratings for 1.7 seconds. Very short duration, very long duration, okay? So on the right panel, you observe the correlation between 26 millisecond ratings and 1.7 second ratings, even very short duration of exposure versus 1.2 second, very long. So what do we observe in these two panels? As for 24 neutral faces only, they do not have any threatening stimuli emanating from their faces. But what we observe is this. Look at the right panel now. Let's assume that I am the participant. I am exposed to a face for 26 milliseconds, okay? I make a very fast judgment about whether it's threatening or not. As you observe, my judgments for 26 millisecond exposures are not very much correlated with my 1.7 millisecond ratings, second ratings, which means whatever judgment I make in 1,700 milliseconds is unrelated to whatever judgment I make for 26 milliseconds. That they are unrelated means that my judgments are not formed at least in 26 milliseconds. It requires more than that. And look at this one now, the left panel. The correlation between 39 millisecond ratings and 1.7 second ratings is 0.77. That's a huge correlation, which means whatever decision we make about a face being threatening or not in 39 milliseconds is very similar to 1.7 seconds, which means that our judgments about a face in terms of it being a threatening face can be decided or can be achieved by our minds only in 39 minutes. So the very first impressions happen in our minds only in 39 milliseconds. It's that fast, okay? So after 39 milliseconds, if we have more and more exposure opportunities, we still derive the same meaning from the same face. The meaning of the face doesn't change after 39 milliseconds. That's why the correlation is very high. So what did we learn out of this experiment? We learned that the very first impressions are achieved in 39 milliseconds. This is 4 times shorter than you blink your eye. Gözünüzü kırpmanızdan 4 kat daha hızlı karar veriyorsunuz bir başka insan hakkında. But this is threat judgment. Threat, meaning a threat for your life, a threat for survival, is very important decision for mind to make. That's why perhaps people are very fast at deciding whether the threat is, whether the face is threatening or not. But if it is not about our survival, do we still make such judgments in that fast? Actually, it's not the case. There is the survival value of threat as a judgment property, but there are other personality characteristics which we may judge from a simple face, but it is not that fast. However, it is almost that fast. Another experiment that I'm going to share with you today is by Willis and Todorov. It's about the first impression that is formed by simply being exposed to faces, but this time the researchers studied some personality characteristics: trustworthiness, competence, likability, aggressiveness, and attractiveness. And what you observe basically in this table is very similar to what we have observed in the previous study. 100 millisecond, 500 millisecond, and 1000 millisecond. Exposure times are used as different experimental conditions. So 100 millisecond is 1/10 of a second, 500 milliseconds is half the second, and 1000 milliseconds is 1 second. 100 millisecond, 500 millisecond, and 1000 millisecond. As you observe, 100 millisecond correlations are very high with other exposure times, meaning that 100 milliseconds is or are sufficient to make a first impression simply from a face in terms of judging its trustworthiness, competence, likability, aggressiveness, and attractiveness. So look at the attractiveness. In 100 milliseconds, we decide that a person is attractive. So it's just this. Again, 100 milliseconds are shorter than you blink your eye. So that we come to like a person at first sight is somewhat true because it happens only in 100 milliseconds. So we have fast and first impressions in milliseconds. That's what we know. Is it good or bad now? Well, it might be good, it might be bad, but we will refer to possible biases in terms of how our first impressions might influence our further judgments about these people. Now here we have a classical study by Darley and Gross, which is conducted in 1983. In this study, they examined the so-called primacy effect. What is primacy effect? In memory research, we know that whatever information comes first influences the way we interpret the next information, pieces of information. So if our minds first make an impression, this impression, it means, influences our further judgments because it comes before these judgments. It provides sense of a kind of sense of predictability. So we try to process new information by trying to assimilate it into our existing schema that is formed in 100 milliseconds, let's say, okay? So this is called the primacy effect. First coming information influences the processing of next coming information. And in this experiment, participants were made to watch a video about a primary school child, a girl who is called Hannah in this video. Everything on the video was same, but there were two specific differences between two conditions. In one condition, participants learned from the video that Hannah's father and mother are low socioeconomic status people. They are working in low status jobs, earning less. So the socioeconomic status was lower, okay, for Hannah. So this was kind of creating a stereotypical belief or stereotypical schema in the mind of the participants. So they believed Hannah comes from an underprivileged or or disadvantaged group. And what is the stereotype? The stereotype is that if people are coming from disadvantaged groups, we do not expect these people to have good school skills or abilities or performance, okay? So this is called the negative expectancy group. On the other side, in another experimental group, the participants watched exactly the same video, but they were told that Hannah's father and mother are working in high status job. One is a lawyer, another is an academician, and so on, okay? So the socioeconomic status was high, meaning that the experimenters are trying to create a positive stereotype in the mind of the participants. So, what's the stereotype? The stereotype is that if people are coming from advantaged groups, they will have better performance or skill levels in the academic domain. But what we observed is that it doesn't work that much because people don't have much time. They simply learn about the socioeconomic status of these groups. And they then, after being exposed to socioeconomic status information, they were asked to indicate their judgments, their evaluations about Hannah's academic performance. As you observe on different graphs to the right of this slide, people who had both positive and negative expectations had similar ratings about Hannah's academic ability, okay? That's good. People are not trying to be judgmental. People are not using their stereotypes to make fast judgments. But the second part of the experiment involved that Hannah solved some problems with a teacher. Teacher reading the questions, Hannah solving, and Hannah was presented in this video with easy, difficult, and moderately difficult questions. So there were different questions with different difficulty levels, and actually Hannah made different amounts of errors in answering these questions. So the performance was moderate, okay? But moderate performance means ambiguity. How will this ambiguity be resolved about Hannah now? Now they have the performance information and they have time to think about Hannah's actual ability level. Then the important point here now, the data is that people who had positive expectancies, who believed Hannah comes from an advantaged group, now changed their ideas. They thought Hannah was a very successful student or high ability student, whereas people with negative attributes now started to believe that Hannah had lower. So this means these people with positive expectancies focused their attention to Hannah's correctly solved problems, and then they assimilated this information to their belief that Hannah will have higher ability just because she is coming from an advantaged group. Now, what we observe here is that the primacy effect, meaning the first stereotypical categorization changed the meaning of neutral behaviors observed by these participants. And people, the participants who had negative expectations, now changed their idea, thinking, as you observe here, thinking that Hannah Hannah has lower school ability. Why? Because they had a negative first impression, actually, and this first impression led them to selectively attend to the questions that Hannah couldn't solve, and they assimilated this information to their first impression. Now, this is a kind of inferential bias, and similar biases can be observed in the relationship context involving also romantic relationships, okay? In romantic relationships, these biases influence our evaluation of our partners, actually. In dating couples, there are studies, for instance, showing that people feel themselves more confident than they should be and less accurate than actual data suggests about judging the abilities of their partners. In such studies, we study with dyads, couples, okay? In these dyads, ikili, in these dyads, there is one target and there is the perceiver. The target is the partner who provides self-ratings about sexual history, self-descriptions, and activity preferences. These are some pieces of information that dating partners would know about themselves, okay? So suppose there is Ayşe and Ahmet. Ayşe provides this information about herself. Now, Ayşe is the target, someone to be perceived by whom? Ahmet, the partner, the perceiver in this case, because perceivers are the participants in dyadic interaction, and perceivers are the partners who provided ratings for the same measures, sexual history, self-description, and activity preferences, but this time about Ayşe. So Ayşe answers for herself. Ahmet answers as he perceives her, okay? And what's the similarity between the two? Perceivers provided also confidence ratings for their responses. So Ahmet says, I'm very confident that she likes going to cinema. Is it the case? Does Ayşe really like going to cinema? Okay, that's the question. But people might feel very confident about themselves, okay? And also, accuracy of their judgments was computed as within dyad correlations. So Ayşe says, I like to go to cinema 7 out of 7, let's say with Likert type scaling, and Ahmet says 7 out of 7. Ayşe likes going to cinema 7 out of 7. Then it means that they have a perfect match about Ayşe's judgment. Now, there are many different qualities that are asked to Ahmet, and if Ayşe's answers and Ahmet's answers are very similar, the correlation coefficient between Ayşe's ratings and Ahmet's ratings should be high. This is the operational definition of accuracy in judgments of Ahmet, of the perceiver. So what are the results? Now look at these results. This study is by Swen and Jill about the confidence and accuracy in person perception. Look at the title. Do we know what we think we know about our relationship partners? Now look at this. As you observe, accuracy ratings are always low. So the correlation coefficient between partners is very low. So people are not accurate at understanding or perceiving correctly the likes and dislikes of their partners. It means it's 39%, let's say, overlap. And look at this line now. On the average, it appears that 75%, with an average of 75%, people feel confident about their judgments for their partners, okay? But look at this, 39% versus 75% on the average. But what we observe here is that as the relationship time or duration is longer and longer, so suppose somebody is dating for 1 month, another dyad is dating for, let's say, 24 months, as length of relationship increases, accuracy does not change. Now, that's a black hole. We think we know our partners very well, but we don't, it means, okay? No matter how long we have time with them. But most importantly, in time, people come to think that they more and more confidently know about their partners. This is called overconfidence bias. People are very sure about judgments. They're confident about judgments about their partners, but they do not know them accurately, actually, and time doesn't make any difference. Why? Why? Simply because we like to assimilate our partners to our existing schemas. We're collecting their behavioral data, okay, but we are selectively using this data to fit into our expectations about them, it means. So we should be very careful, perhaps, about our judgments about our partners in relationships, it means. Now, what might influence then our overconfidence in our judgments? What might influence our inaccurate judgments about our partners. One of the processes proposed by social psychologists is the so-called process of idealization. Idealization means that we have a definition of an ideal partner in our minds, and we come to assimilate our partners to this ideal schema. So perhaps our partner is not that ideal, but we come to perceive our partners as the ideal partners as we define it in our minds. And what we observe in this study by Solomon and Wazir is about the attractiveness of a partner. So in this study, partner ratings of attractiveness, as you observe here, are higher than self ratings and friend ratings. What does that mean? So how attractive are you? This is asked to one of the partners in a relationship. And the same question is asked, how attractive is Ayşe, to a friend of Ayşe? And the same question was asked to the partner of Ayşe, Ahmet, okay? How attractive is Ayşe? So Ayşe thinks about her attractiveness and rates it. So Ayşe evaluates her attractiveness, a friend of Ayşe evaluates her attractiveness, and Ayşe's partner evaluates her attractiveness. And what we observe here is that Ayşe believes she is moderately attractive, whereas Ahmet, her partner, believes she is very much attractive. So this is called idealization. And as you observe, friends are a little bit more realistic than romantic partners. So they do not idealize, but romantic partners do. And we observe here that self and partner agreement is lower than self-friend agreement. So that's why we know that friends are more realistic than partners. Partners are not realistic. They are idealizing their relationship companions. Okay. In another study about idealization process, different kinds of personality characteristics were measured to understand this idealization process. And in this study, participants rated positive and negative qualities, both for themselves, their partners, and for an ideal partner. So if you would like to observe whether there is an idealization or not, we should have an independent measurement of idealization. And we can achieve such kind of a measurement through measuring what is your ideal partner schema, and also measuring how would you evaluate your partner. If my partner's evaluation and my ideal partner schema evaluations overlap, if the correlation between them is too high, it means that I am idealizing my partner, okay? So positive attributes were kind and affectionate, self-assured, menopause, rational, patient, tolerant, and so on, very relevant for a relationship context. And negative attributes were critical, judgmental, lazy, dominant, controlling, distant, complaining, immature. So just imagine the situation. I am rating myself, I am rating my partner, and I'm rating my ideal partner in terms of these same in terms of these different positive and negative attributes. And partner and ideal partner similarity in terms of correlations indicate idealization. Now let's look at what influences the relationship quality. Is it what kind of a person I am? Is it what kind of a person my partner is? Or is it my idealization of my partner? Okay, so my quality, my personality characteristics may influence my relationship quality. My partner's qualities, as I perceive it, might influence the relationship quality, or my idealization might influence the relationship quality. Which one? Do we really idealize? And if we idealize, what's the outcome of this idealization? And as you observe in this graph, the satisfaction with the relationship is always high, and it does not change in time if the partner is highly idealizing the other person in the relationship. So look at this upper line. As you observe, our initial idealization at the time of dating, the first date, let's say, our initial, or the first month, let's say, our initial idealization of our partners, if it is high, then our high idealization is highly correlated with our satisfaction. It doesn't change. The more we idealize, the more we are satisfied with our relationship. That's the positive side. But just observe the second line here, okay, the dots, black dots line. If the idealization initially was low, satisfaction decreased and decreased, okay, in time. So when dating, idealization doesn't work much, but in the long run, okay, because these are equal, okay, but in the long run, as the relationship advances up to 36 months, it means 3 years, initial idealization comes to predict our relationship satisfaction. The more we idealize, the more we are satisfied with. But if we are not idealizing that much, in time, we lose our interest and satisfaction with our relationship. So idealization might seem that we are knowing our partners in a wrong manner. We do not have an accurate sense of who actually our partners are, but it has a function. Idealization helps us to be happy with our relationships, okay? In the, that our perceptions influence the way our relationships form and are maintained, we also have the ways of explaining the behaviors of ourselves and of our partners, which we call attributional processes. And let's first remember what attributions are. Attributions are our explanations for the behaviors of ourselves and of our partners. So an attribution involves a cause, and this cause is subjectively judged by the person to explain the behavior of the self and the partner. In a romantic relationship, we have two people involved. So it's an interpersonal process. And in an interpersonal process, it's not only Ayşe who makes attributions about herself and Ahmet, but also it is Ahmet who makes attributions about himself and Ayşe. So in a given typical interaction between Ahmet and Ayşe, they are both perceiving each other, and they are both targets of their own perception. So sometimes, for instance, from Ayşe's point of view, Ahmet is the actor. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, Ahmet is the actor, and Ahmet is the actor, and Ayşe is the observer. Okay. Ayşe as observer can evaluate her behaviors in the relationship behaviors, different than Ahmet, perhaps, or different than evaluating Ahmet's behaviors. So this is called actor-observer bias. So what's the formal definition? Actor-observer bias is the tendency of the actor to attribute his or her own behaviors to situational causes. So when I am actor, for instance, suppose I am in interaction with an interaction partner, I am saying good words to her, praising her, okay, in a relationship, in a heterosexual relationship, I am the actor of my own acts, okay, and I perceive myself in terms of attributing my own behaviors to situational causes if they are especially negative behaviors. So if I, let's say, if I am quarreling with my partner, and if I am shouting at her, I'm saying it was a tiring day. I was very tired today. That's why I couldn't control myself. So as the actor, I attribute my behavior to situational external causes. Whereas for the observer, actor's behavior, me again, is attributed to dispositional or internal causes. So I am shouting at her. I say it was a bad day. That's why I can't control myself and shout. But she says he is a rude person. He's a dominant man who's trying to domineer me. So it's a dispositional attribution. So depending on whether we are actors or observers, our explanations for our own behaviors change, okay? So why is this the case? Because in a given context, the context is salient for the actor. Remember, our attention is directed towards the outside and the outer environment, okay? Directed towards the outside. And actors, as acting people, their attention is on the environment, so they can quickly guess or quickly capture and understand the environmental influences on their behaviors. Whereas the actor's behavior is salient for the observer. So when I do something negative in a relationship context, I'm aware of the situational forces acting on me. I had a bad day at work today, which cannot be known perhaps by my partner, but my behavior is the only salient information which can be received by my partner. She observes my behavior. I'm shouting. And when outside observers observe the behaviors, they have no quick judgments than attributing our behaviors to our internal causes, our personalities, okay? And actors also know about their past behaviors in different contexts. So they might be more likely to overestimate the influence of the context on their behaviors. So as the person who is shouting at the partner, I know in the past, in similar situations, I didn't behave that way. My partner doesn't need to know this if we do not have a long period of time spent together. And I might judge my behavior to be an exception in this case, but my partner can't know this. So the actor-observer bias changes the attributions in the relationship context, and depending on the attributional style, the quality of the relationship changes. So in a relationship, perspectives and judgments coming from these perspectives of the partners might strongly influence the quality of the relationship. So, about the actor-observer bias, what we know is that we observe actor-observer bias more in intimate rather than non-intimate partners. So what is intimates? Intimates are parent-child dyads, close friend dyads, or romantic partner dyads, whereas non-intimates are strangers and acquaintances. So intimates have stronger actor-observer bias, as meta-analyses show. This is, remember, small to medium effect size. It means there is some considerable amount of actor-observer bias in relationships of intimates, whereas for non-intimates, we have very weak actor-observer bias. So knowing each other more is not a prerequisite, is not guaranteed that no matter we are intimate partners. We might have stronger actor-observer biases. And this bias is especially observed for external attributions. So I do something wrong, something unacceptable. I attribute it to situational causes. My partner attributes it to internal causes, and especially for making external attributions, explaining the behavior without taking its responsibility with internal reasons, is especially observed between intimate partners. Now, this is a fracture. This is a risk for fracture, kırılma, çatlak in relationships. So that's why we should be perhaps aware of such kind of biases in our relationships, and we should be very careful about communicating our explanations to our partners, because this would influence the way we communicate. We may blame the partner if we make continually internal attributions for his or her unacceptable behaviors, or we may make our partners upset if we are explaining our own wrong behaviors in terms of situational factors. We should consider both at the same time. So the good point is, if partners put conscious effort to reduce actor-observer bias, it decreases, but it does not disappear at all. Why? Simply because we have a self-concept for which we would like to have a positive evaluation. If I could have accepted the responsibility of all my wrong actions in a relationship, I would lose self-esteem. Now, that's the critical point, okay? So let's give a break, take a break at this point, and go on in the next hour.